So if you're on our mailing list, or if you're not and you'd like to join, we have a sign-up sheet out front. Or check our website and we will provide you all with some updates on that rescheduling. We're really hoping that we can get Dr. White down here. I'd also like to thank our generous co-sponsors tonight, who include the UF Smathers Library, the Hyatt and C.C. Brown Endowment for Florida Archaeology, UF's Honors Program, the Department of History, the Sam Proctor Oral History Program, and UF's Office of Sustainability, and of course, Dr. Kidd representing the Department of English. And it's true to say that without these valuable co-sponsors, we wouldn't be able to put on these programs and test out venues like the Hippodrome. This is the first talk that we've had here, and we're very, very excited about reaching potential new audiences. I'd also like to thank the Associate Director of the Center, Dr. Sophia Akerd, our assistants, Megan Leroy and Sarah Harms, for their hard work in making this talk possible. Phoebe Wilson at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences helped with publicity. We'd like to invite you to join the discussion by reserving your questions for the Q&A portion of tonight's session. And if you'd like to join us on Twitter, we ask that you use the hashtag #UFCivilSociety. That's one word. My mention of electronic media is also your opportunity to silence all alarms and so forth. Just wanted to give a brief reminder of that. And now for our speaker. Dr. Diana Senechal holds a PhD in Slavic languages and literatures from Yale. She plays cello, and she's worked as an editor and has taught in settings ranging from teaching elementary school on the Crow Reservation in Montana to teaching English to teenagers and adults in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. A wide range. Currently, Dr. Senechal teaches philosophy at Columbia Secondary School for Math, Science, and Engineering in New York City. She has a wide range also of intellectual interests, an impressive range going from translations of Lithuanian poetry to writing on education for a variety of publications, including Education Week, The New Republic, and The Washington Post. Her recent book, which I've been reading over the past few days, fascinating, called The Republic of Noise, The Loss of Solitude in Schools and Culture, published by Rowman and Littlefield Education in 2012, is the recipient of the Hyatt Prize in Humanities. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Am I pronouncing that right? Hyatt, of course. It's not an introduction unless I mispronounce something. The book draws from an impressive array of sources: history, literature, educational research, personal experience, to make the point that solitude is firmly grounded in our consciousness and in our culture. The current trend towards connectivity via technological and organizational innovation, although well-meaning, threatens the most productive elements of that solitude. And Senechal suggests that solitude's deep roots prove its worth as a significant element in the future of education. And she does this, I think, remarkably without employing a reactionary or anti-technological stance. And one of the most moving and truest lines I found in the book is, she says near the beginning, "We cannot accomplish anything of beauty until we are willing to spend many hours working on it alone." But we're all here together, so you can spend your hours in solitude later on after the talk. And so without further delay, it's my pleasure to turn over the floor to Dr. Diana Senechal, who is speaking on the slow murmur of learning, honoring substance and solitude in education.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction, and thanks to everybody for coming this evening. It's an honor to be here, and it has been a joyous past couple of days. And if I could have the first slide, please. Just want to make sure that I have evidence of technology here. Okay. So I'll begin because the slide doesn't really come until a few minutes into it, but just explain that evidence of technology. The first school where I taught in New York City, for the teacher evaluation checklist included a checkbox for evidence of technology. And so you were observed during a lesson and you were supposed to show evidence of technology. and whatever it might be. And a slideshow would do just fine. So, in the spirit of that, I like slideshows, I find them very useful. But this talk is not really about technology, it's about the loss of individual judgment in our classrooms. Reforms have been stampeding through our classrooms, and schools have been scrambling to change all kinds of things, their curricula, teacher evaluation systems, tests, pedagogy, and more, but to the satisfaction of outside evaluators, not to their own satisfaction. And someone else's judgment or the judgment of a formula is held up higher than our own. And colleges and universities face similar pressures to show results, modernize their practices, again on someone else's terms. In the clamor and rush, little room remains for thoughtful study of subject matter or good judgment about how to teach it. Okay, the problem lies not only in the rush, though that is a problem, but in the reforms themselves, which are designed to supersede rather than encourage individual judgment. The consequences are profound, since education is nothing if it does not encourage the work of the mind. To educate and be educated, one must be at liberty to think alone and with others, to take in ideas and works, to exercise judgment, and to see beyond superficial understandings. This is the spirit of solitude, which balks at dogma and thrives on dialogue. Now that may be a curious idea that solitude thrives on dialogue, so I'll explain a little bit. Let's consider what solitude actually is, what it has to do with dialogue, and why it is essential to education. Solitude is commonly understood as removal from others. To be in solitude is to be off in a field by oneself or to be alone in a room, but there's much more to it. There's a much richer meaning. One can think of it as a kind of integrity. To be in solitude is to have a full range of thought, without compromise, interruption, or distraction. We can have this in the company of others, in a large room with many people, and we can fail to have it when alone in a room. Well, then one might ask, why not call it integrity? Why not call it mindfulness? That word is quite popular right now. Well, I call it solitude, as have many people in the past, because I do not wish to diminish the aspect of being alone, or obscure the idea that a certain kind of aloneness can open up into company. We live in a culture that extols teams. I'll talk a little bit about that later. Teams and teamwork, to the point where even choral groups sometimes refer to themselves as choral teams. Some vigorous idea of solitude is necessary as a counterbalance, but solitude also suggests a relation with the self and others. One must be alone in order to listen closely, and listening is fundamental to such relation. Education which brings students into relation with the world around them requires solitude as part of its foundation. I will illustrate this with a quote from St. Augustine's Confessions, and here, let's see, now we're working, okay, good. And what is the object of my love? I asked the earth, and it said, it is not I. I asked all that is in it. They made the same confession. I asked the sea, the deeps, the living creatures that creep, and they responded, we are not your God, look beyond us. I asked the breezes which blow, and the entire air with its inhabitants said, Anaximenes was mistaken, I am not God. I asked heaven, sun, moon, and stars, and they said, nor are we the God whom you seek. And I said to all these things in my external environment, tell me of my God, who you are not, tell me something about him. And with a great voice they cried out, he made us. My question was the attention I gave to them, and their response was their beauty. So that final sentence appears as the unlocking of a code, the solving of a riddle. This dialogue with the earth, the sea, the living creatures, breezes, air, birds, heaven, sun, moon, and stars, all of this occurs actually in silence and in solitude. The surprise is that it consists of attention and beauty. The dialogue is the attention and the beauty. The passage is filled with yearning, with awe and imagination. It gives speech to speechless things and fills silence with sound. Such a dialogue with creation is possible only in solitude. One must bring one's full self to it. One could not imagine this happening in a classroom where a turn and talk activity was going on. It would just be too busy. So in a typical classroom today, unfortunately, such a passage would likely be subjected to a number of generic routines. Okay? Students would not have the opportunity to listen to it. Okay. Students would be asked to summarize the passage, list the sequence of events, identify the main idea, and cite textual details in support of their opinion and interpretation. And in addition, they would be expected to produce concrete evidence of their learning. Okay. And so they would not have the opportunity typically to take the passage on its own terms, follow its movement and shape, and experience the surprise at the end, the great surprise. Instead, the text would be treated as a means toward attaining a skill. And one could imagine a lesson proceeding as follows. Today, we are going to learn about sequence. Often, when we have trouble understanding a text, it helps to list the text events in order. Today, all of you will produce a list of events in a passage we are going to read by St. Augustine. But first, I will give you some simpler examples of this activity. You can imagine this. After a brief presentation on sequencing, the teacher puts the students in groups to list the events on the chart paper, and then the room becomes noisy, and the teacher circulates around the room and points out to a student that he wrote birds on the list, but there are no birds in the passage. And he replies that, well, there are, because the passage mentions the inhabitants of the air, and the teacher then says, well, you're supposed to focus on what the text actually says, and moves on. And I'm not blaming the teacher. This is what teachers are told to do. And at the end of the class, the group members affix their list to the wall, and the bird is crossed off of the list, and those who list all the events correctly and show group cooperation are given the highest grade. And when everybody's gone, the teacher takes a picture of one of the lists as evidence of learning for her own portfolio, so that she has an artifact for her own, for tenure or whatever it may be, for her evaluation. Now, there is nothing wrong with expecting students to learn specific skills and content, including the skill of identifying the sequence of events. That can be very useful. And in fact, specificity is a feature of a strong curriculum. It's through the specifics that one can really be inspired and come to some interesting ideas. Okay, the problem lies in reducing the subject matter to something flat and drab. In this case, a list that could be of use in a larger discussion, but here becomes the goal of the lesson. In many districts around the country, teachers are required to write an aim on the board for every lesson, and to begin with the phrase, students will be able to. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to do X, Y, and Z. But sometimes in lessons, it's important to give students something that they won't yet be able to do, and to let them grapple for a while with something that they can't do, something that they may not fully understand, and to let them understand that this is okay, that struggle is all right, and not quite understanding it is okay too, and that's part of learning. Okay, and that means allowing for lessons where students do not emerge with a complete product or any product at all. It means having no aim except to delve into the topic and discuss the complexities. Sometimes it is even advisable to let students take something in without discussing it right away at all. Yet the idea of conducting a lesson without a measurable goal makes many educators and policymakers nervous. They fear, sometimes with justification, that fuzziness upon fuzziness will result in no learning at all. If students are just being exposed to ideas, well, what do they walk out with? Okay? They might not even understand the ideas to which they're being exposed. It all becomes uncertain. And of course, this is a real danger. It can happen, and it does happen. And with the best of intentions, it can happen. But to demand concrete outcomes from every lesson is to shortchange the subject matter. To subordinate literature to standardized skill instruction is to ignore its life and its strangeness. It may seem that I'm beating up a straw man, criticizing crude skill-focused lessons that don't actually exist. The problem is that they not only exist in spades, but are treated as the norm. In many districts, this is supposedly the way to teach. There's a website, Learn Zillion, and I'm naming it not to single it out because it's quite typical. It offers many lessons that are supposedly aligned to the Common Core, and the Common Core was supposed to encourage very close reading of complex, interesting, compelling texts. But this website has many lessons that focus primarily on the skill and subordinate the literature to the skill. And there's an example, a series of 7 lessons, devoted to Wordsworth's poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. And almost without exception, the 7 lessons treat the poem as something practically irrelevant or simply as a means towards attaining a skill. And the lesson almost disappears from the poem almost disappears from the picture. And I cite this example because it is typical of many lessons I have seen, and because it gives a special insight into the problem. Each of the 7 video lessons focuses on a specific skill, and one lesson is about the skill of summarizing. The speaker instructs the students to summarize each stanza on a sticky note in order to understand the poem better. And this may be good for certain poems, but for this poem, and I think we should just take a minute with it, it distracts from the poem because the poem is so short and the meaning is so subtle that if you were to summarize each stanza, and I'll explain why in a second, you would be departing from the poem. You would be departing from the language of the poem, and in departing from the language, you would also be departing from a great deal of the meaning. So let's just take a moment. I'll recite the poem, and then I'll explain how this departs from the poem. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high or veils on hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not be but gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on the couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. Now, if you look at that last stanza there, how would a person summarize it? The person could say, sometimes when I'm lying on my couch, I remember the daffodils and then I feel happy. And that's missing the point entirely. So the problem is not that summarizing is wrong. It's wrong for this poem. So we have to look at what's right for this poem. Now, for this event, I memorized the poem for this occasion, but I had it about 95% memorized from having read it so many times. But what really needed, what I still needed to do was have it snap into place. And in particular, the transitions between the stanzas had to make sense to me, and then I remembered the whole poem. But in fact, with this poem, the transitions between the stanzas tells so much about the meaning. So take, for instance, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine. That word continuous tells us that here's a continuation of a vision and a thought. That for a while, we're just going to be watching the daffodils. Then when the next stanza comes along, we return to the first person. 10,000 saw I at a glance. The speaker is reintroduced, and the consciousness of the speaker is reintroduced, and there's some kind of idea of singularity and juxtaposed with the 10,000. A very interesting idea. Here's I, and here's the 10,000, and they have something in common, tossing their heads in sprightly dance, and then this is continued. The waves beside them dance, so it seems that they're in company with the waves, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. So these 10,000 daffodils or more have something singular about them, something special. And that's their meeting with the speaker. So there's something special in the speaker and something about the daffodils, and it's they who come together. And so then in the final stanza, the transition to the final stanza, that colon is like an opening. Everything here has been leading to this inward eye. And we learned that it's the memory, the ability to think back on this when alone, that is the bliss of solitude. And that all of this could be considered the cloud, actually. The outward eye could be the lonely cloud, and then this bliss of solitude could actually be analogous to the daffodils themselves. And there are so many things being compared here, so many conversations between different things. The cloud itself, wandering, lonely, floating and fluttering are associated. And my point here is, we could go on about this. There's more and more to find about the poem, but when you pay attention to the poem itself, then the meanings start to unfold. And when doing so, you do so many things. You're listening to the sounds of the poem. You're looking at the structure. In some sense, you're summarizing. But you're not doing them for the sake of summarizing. You're not doing it for the sake of identifying the rhyme patterns. You're not doing it for the sake of those skills. Those things all play into your reading of the poem. So, other topics in the series of the 7 lessons include distinguishing strong verbs from weak verbs, analyzing harsh and soft sounds, identifying symbols, and identifying the theme. And each one goes wrong because it departs from the poem. These are not necessarily problematic in themselves. They have pitfalls, but they all could be good exercises, but the detachment is the problem. So, for example, in the lesson on harsh and soft sounds, the speaker states that the line, "I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth is," said that that's full of harsh sounds, which she calls cacophonous sounds. And there's nothing cacophonous about that line. It's a line with pauses. It's a slow, "I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought." You feel it stretching out. It does not feel harsh. It does not feel as though the sounds are clashing. So one has to apply these things very carefully. And then things get even worse. In the crowning lesson of the series, the lesson on theme, the speaker states that the poem's theme is, "Enjoy the beautiful, joyous moments in your life, because if you feel lonely in the future, you can look back on those memories and be happy." And it would have probably been better to seek no theme at all. So this is only, this kind of idiosyncratic study, the idea of taking the poem on its own terms, finding its life, and applying these particular methods very flexibly, and very sensitively. This is essential to the sciences as well as the humanities, and this arouses distrust in policymakers who suspect educators and institutions of trying to mask their poor results. So if you say that, "I'm not going to teach a lesson on skills, I want to teach students to enter this particular poem," they'll say, "Well, what does that mean? That's not concrete enough." But it is concrete. Today there's a great push to extend standardized testing and other measurement tools into higher education so that colleges and universities will have to show student growth like everyone else. And some pundits have waxed euphoric about this. Why should colleges ride on their prestige alone? They should have to show results. They should have to show that students are growing. The irony is that such measures can hamper the very possibility of growth in higher education. Consider, for instance, a course in Russian literature. Say it's a lecture course, and they're taught by a scholar in Russian literature, and students of many different backgrounds take this course. And some students entering the course may speak Russian fluently, this happens, and may have read Pushkin, Gogol, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov throughout their lives. They may be interested in this reintroduction, this different perspective. And others may be encountering Russian literature for the first time. And what does growth mean then? Certainly some will be learning about these works. They will grow in their understanding of these works, but others who know these works will grow in some other way. And how could a test possibly measure growth in that context? Certainly a test could measure their basic comprehension of the works, right? And maybe to some degree their interpretation. But there is a lot of many subtleties would get missed by the standardized tests. And if the professors felt pressure to show growth on standardized tests, then they would also end up sacrificing many of these subtleties. Now, some may say subtleties are fine and well for the advanced student, but we can't afford to be subtle right now. That's a common argument. Too many students aren't even getting the basics. They are entering college unable to write coherent sentences. They are unprepared for employment and for the challenges of the 21st century. For this reason, we have to keep a closer eye on what we're doing. For this reason, the short-term results are so important. We have to help these young people progress, and that means not only ensuring their academic growth, but keeping them engaged so that they don't drop out and slip behind. And we have a responsibility to do this. This means shaping instruction to meet their needs, and not our own view of the subject matter. Now, there's truth to this. This is a legitimate argument, but the proposed solutions are rife with problems. So I'm going to move now on to the topic of engagement, which I feel is it's a concept that is misconceived in education, and this is leading to many problematic situations. Many policymakers and consultants and others assert correctly that engagement is key. Thus, they advise schools to do whatever they can to raise the engagement of all students, to keep all students engaged. But what do they define as engagement? How do they seek to boost it? And what are the costs of such action? The Schlechty Center, which offers consultative services to schools and districts around the country and is often cited on the subject of student engagement, defines an engaged student, let's see, we have it, as one who finds the activity personally meaningful, has high enough interest to persist in the face of the difficulty, believes that he or she will accomplish something substantial through this activity, and is intent on optimum performance and getting it right. Now this sounds reasonable. Of course this is engagement. If I look back over my life as a student and teacher, I see that the students who did well in school had these traits, these qualities, these disciplines. They found personal meaning in the subject matter. They were intent on getting it right. They realized that they had to dedicate themselves to it. They had high enough interest. They would persist in the face of difficulty. It may even be true, and there's some research to support the idea, that a boost in student engagement overall leads to a boost in performance. However, one must ask, performance of what? Okay. The very act of getting everyone engaged, everybody, at once in any given lesson can involve some sacrifice of subject matter. So the Schlechty Center offers 10 design qualities intended to promote engagement. I will point to a few ones that I see as problematic. These are heavily touted and enforced in schools today. Now, they didn't invent this list. These are qualities that have been discussed for quite some time, and they've come from many sources and from a great deal of research on engagement. But one of these is clear and compelling product standards, which refers to the extent to which students are clear about what they are to do, and what the products they produce should look like, what standards will be applied to evaluate these products and their performances, and how much value students attach to the standards that are to be used. That is, do students believe in the standards and see them as personally compelling? Now, this makes sense, but there are two serious problems here. First, the assumption already discussed earlier that an activity should result in a product. This is not necessarily so. And second, the idea that students should know exactly what their products should look like. It's one thing to give them guidelines. For instance, an essay, a basic idea of the essay's structure, or a number of choices of topic for an essay. But when you tell them exactly what it should look like at the end, what you're doing is you're favoring the student who wants to do everything right to get a good grade, and you may be disfavoring a student who wants to take an intellectual risk. Because if you're taking an intellectual risk, then it may not look like this specified end result. Any serious intellectual endeavor involves some uncertainty and blundering. If one knows from start to finish exactly what one is supposed to do, and if one always has the assurance of a concrete product, then one loses the vastness of the undertaking. I do not mean that students should jump into the vastness with no guidance or structure, but an element of the unknown is necessary. In her essay, Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God, with a caveat, this also has application to a secular context, Simone Weil writes, if we concentrate our attention on trying to solve a problem of geometry, and if at the end of an hour, we are no nearer to doing so than at the beginning, we have nevertheless been making progress each minute of that hour in another more mysterious dimension. Without our knowing or feeling it, this apparently barren effort has brought more light into the soul. Now, of course, yes, most of us are working in a secular context, and there is some value to actually solving a geometry problem. Nevertheless, Weil's words offer a counterbalance to our obsession with concrete results and products. The lack of material results is often part of intellectual life. If students expect quick results and products from everything they do, then they will have no access to this mysterious dimension. One may temporarily engage students by giving them concrete tasks and outcomes, but in doing so, one robs them of deeper engagement, or one can. Another problematic item on the Schlechty Center's list, and another one that looks eminently reasonable. Affiliation, there we go. Namely, it's affiliation, namely the possibility of designing tasks so that students are provided the opportunity to work with peers as well as with parents, outside experts, and other adults, including but not limited to the teacher. Now, of course, this sounds like a good idea. Students should have an audience for their work. They should be able to work with others, and I should be the first proponent of that. My students are putting out a philosophy journal. It's very proud. But in the early stages, maybe not. And when you publish everything, this is something that David Reisman brought up as a problem in his book, 1950 book, The Lonely Crowd, that there had been a movement toward publishing student work everywhere. Their art, their writing on the walls of the classroom. This is still prevalent today. What can happen as a result of this, and a result of which we must beware, is a tendency of students to then back away from anything that their peers might not like, to tailor their work to the tastes and judgment of their peers. So even though, yes, it is very important for students to be able to work with others, to be able to hear from others, to have an audience of others, it is important also to reserve some time for them, to give them some time to work out their ideas before subjecting it to anybody else's judgment, and to teach them the value of this as well, so that they can then become strong in what they do. And then if a peer makes fun of it or something like that, they know well that that's their peer's limitation, or if it's a legitimate criticism, they're able to discern between a legitimate criticism and one that simply reflects misunderstanding. But when you publish student work all the time, that may not be the case. Okay, so when everything, if we go too far with the group work and with the publishing of student work and with the making of everything into a group activity, we lose some respect for eccentricity, which is such an important part of education. And about eccentricity, John Stuart Mill wrote in his treatise on liberty. Precisely because the tyranny of opinion is such as to make eccentricity a reproach, it is desirable, in order to break through that tyranny, that people should be eccentric. Eccentricity has always abounded when and where strength of character has abounded, and the amount of eccentricity in a society has generally been proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage which it contained. That so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of our time. And I asked my students about this passage in my political philosophy class, 11th graders, and whether they saw that as a danger still today. And their responses were interesting. They said that on the one hand, we seem to approve of eccentricity. We seem to believe that people should just be themselves and be different, and difference is great. But many of them felt that this was a veneer, and that people, especially in high school, were intolerant of true difference. That even with they tolerated certain kinds of differences, but not others. As soon as the difference became too abrasive in their view, they would reject it. And it was remarkable to hear them say this and discuss it. And a group work often, unfortunately, can discourage the kind of eccentricity that John Stuart Mill describes here. Clearly, the principles discussed above, such as having activities result in products, having clear guidelines, giving students opportunities to work with others, do not have to be taken to extremes. When applied thoughtfully, they can make learning more rewarding. Yet one of the greatest problems with education reform is its dogmatism, its insistence that if a principle or reform is to be, any principle that sounds good to people should be applied across the board in a visible and often superficial manner without subtlety or discretion. This is playing out in two main components of teacher evaluations: classroom observations and value-added assessment. States and districts undergoing teacher evaluation reform are moving away from planned classroom observations toward unannounced short observations. In New York City, for instance, a teacher may choose to have 1 formal and 3 short informal observations, or to have just 6 short observations instead of a formal observation. And teachers in many schools are encouraged to move toward the 6, just because supposedly those little snapshots will give a more realistic picture of what's actually happening in the classroom. The fear, which is somewhat legitimate, is that if you have a planned observation, then you have a chance to prepare a big show, make a great impression, and distort some of the picture, whereas if the principal or other administrator can pop in at any time and make short observations, the general picture will be more honest. But the problem is that the administrator is supposed to make low inference observations, that is, to note exactly what he or she sees, no more, no less. no interpretation or minimal interpretation. So walks in, writes down what's going on very literally, walks out, and then takes those notes, applies them to a rubric, and assigns the teacher a rating according to the rubric. So such observation really has little to do with the substance of the lesson. We need context. We need to be able to make judgment, but instead principals and other observers are encouraged to leave their judgment behind and to focus literally on what they see. So this means, for instance, if a teacher is being rated on engagement, the principal has decided to come in to look specifically for engagement, and sees that some students are looking off to the side, looking out the window, or look a little bit distracted, that teacher will not get a top rating on engagement. But something might be going on that the principal is not acknowledging or not allowed to acknowledge in this context. For instance, the teacher could be presenting a very difficult topic, and some students may be they may be overwhelmed by it at first. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the engagement is poor or that this is not leading to some kind of engagement that could be more meaningful in the future. But the focus on literal observation is indeed, it's robbing both administrators and teachers of the ability to exercise their judgment in observing the classroom and in teaching the class. So to illustrate the problem, I will quote an item from the Danielson rubric, which is used in New York City for classroom observation and in many other districts around the country. So the rubric is divided into 4 domains: planning and preparation, the classroom environment, instruction, and professional responsibilities. And these contain a total of 22 components. And under instruction, component 3B pertains to questioning and discussion techniques, some of the most important aspects of classroom teaching. So a highly effective teacher in the New York City version of the rubric uses a variety or series of questions or prompts to challenge students cognitively, advance high-level thinking and discourse, and promote metacognition, thinking about one's own thinking. Students formulate many questions, initiate topics, challenge one another's thinking, and make unsolicited contributions. Students themselves ensure that all voices are heard. Now, this sounds great. In fact, one could have little objection with it, except that it depends very much on the type of course. You might see this more in one kind of class than in another. In a very advanced class, in a class that's difficult all along the way for students, for instance, when they're taking calculus for the first time, they're going to be so focused on absorbing the new topics that they're learning every single time that they're not likely to initiate topics themselves. They would not know which topics to initiate. Nor are they likely to ensure that all voices are heard, nor is it necessarily important for all voices to be heard in that context. There must be some room for students to be quiet while they're taking something in. They do not always have to be voicing their opinions about things. Okay? There is a place and time for those things, and there is a place and time to refrain from those things. There's wisdom in staying silent when you haven't yet formed a view. Yet under this particular rubric, especially with low inference observations, teachers get higher ratings if more students speak and suggest topics and so forth. So another problematic category in this rubric is, once again, engagement. The rubric describes a scenario that indicates student engagement. Students take initiative to improve the lesson by 1, modifying a learning task to make it more meaningful or relevant to their needs, 2, suggesting modifications to the grouping patterns used. This assumes that there are grouping patterns used, and or suggesting modifications or additions to the materials being used. Such a description, yes, we've got that. Okay. Such a description carries implicit disapproval of a lesson in which students are given something to learn, but students do need to be introduced to material they wouldn't have chosen on their own or that doesn't seem to meet their needs right away. That their view of their needs may not be complete at that given time. Such confrontation with challenging material can cause initial discomfort. Students may ask for different material or more group work or something else to make the lesson more palatable. The teacher who gives in to all such demands may do the students a disservice. Of course, there are times when students make constructive suggestions that really should be taken into account, but that often happens once the students have a handle on the subject matter. So it often matters at what point in the year this occurs. Yet the rubric doesn't take that into account. By the end of the year, students may be in a position to initiate topics and do all kinds of interesting things. In the beginning of the year, it may be important to give them a structured view of the subject matter. At my current school, where philosophy is a required subject, I met with initial resistance from students when I introduced a high school curriculum with many philosophical texts. They were used to having little to no homework for philosophy, so they continually asked me why we couldn't have more debates, which they very much enjoyed. And I explained to them that I was willing to include debates once they had shown that they could take in a complex idea and follow a line of argument. I sensed that they enjoyed debates because they were swift, energetic, and polarized, because the goal was to defend a predetermined position and not to find one's way to a new one. And over time, I did include debates in my courses, but by this point, the students had read Plato, Aristotle, Aristophanes, Hobbes, Locke, Machiavelli, Mill, and other philosophers, and had many discussions where the point was not to take a side, but instead come closer to an understanding. By resisting my students' requests at the outset, I was able to honor them more meaningfully later. That might not have come across in a classroom observation. Student choice and initiative have vastly different meanings in different situations, but the Danielson rubric privileges student choice and initiative across the board. The classroom observations are meant to complement other aspects of teacher evaluation, such as value-added assessments, that is, the practice of ranking and rating teachers on the basis of their students' test score growth. I will not go into the details of value-added assessments because it's been discussed in great detail elsewhere, but I will point only to one of the most glaring problems, that many subjects lack standardized tests designed to measure growth, and arguably could not develop them without distorting the subjects themselves. Thus, many teachers in New York City are to be rated according to subjects that they don't teach, and often students that they don't teach. A music teacher, for instance, might be rated according to the school's overall English or social studies scores. The absurdity needs no further comment, but the underlying problem does. The current classroom observations and the value-added rating, both they have a problem in common, that the assessments stand in for human discernment and judgment. For a variety of reasons, we have set ourselves up to defer to the blunt judgment of insensate instruments. But what is education for if not to develop discernment and judgment? And what are we as educators doing if we do not exercise judgment ourselves? Yet we as educators have been giving up our own discernment and judgment. Instead of putting an interesting problem on the board, we dutifully write out the aim. Even I do that too. I call it the grand objective of the lesson. Instead, and then I put a not so grand objective below it. The kids are all very eager for the not so grand objective. Instead of encouraging focused, sustained discussions, administrators tell teachers to put students in groups so that everybody is engaged in talking. Instead of devoting attention to the substance of the curriculum, schools and districts put most of their energy into fulfilling the mandates, aligning their curriculum with the standards and their pedagogy with the rubric, preparing students for the standardized tests, and coping with the pressures of increased class sizes and limited space. In such an environment, the sad part is that many educators actually begin to doubt themselves. They begin to waver. They begin to wonder whether they had been wrong all along, much like the animals in Orwell's Animal Farm. Did I really see something different painted on the wall there, or was I imagining things? There is such a discrepancy, some call it a disconnect, between what we know is right, or believe firmly is right, and what we are told to do, that many of us begin to waver and equivocate. Some try to convert to the prevailing worldview, which unfortunately is not a worldview at all. The question then arises, what can be done? How can educators defend education itself? How can we protect schools from fads and dogma and turn the schools into places of good thought? The first answer is that we must uphold our intellectual, spiritual, and artistic lives. We must dare to devote ourselves to literature, music, mathematics, and to grant each field its integrity. And even looking back at the slideshow, there's one more piece, but just looking back, which would I rather spend more time with? I mean, I would rather spend my time with this, and this, and this, than the other things which are written in such bureaucratic language and seem to me to have so little to do with education. So, instead of suffering, I'm very sorry if I do not mean to offend anybody, but instead of suffering through the wrong kind of professional development sessions, We could actually have seminars in the schools about literary topics, about historical topics. We could be discussing mathematical theorems. By contrast, much professional development with this narrow definition of professional, again, it's a focus on concrete products, leaves many educators with a vague sense of despair. And it need not do so. Okay. In his 1992 book, Politics by Other Means, Higher Education and Group Thinking, it's a wonderful book. David Bromwich notes that, I quote, professional development really has no more moral claim on us than real estate development. I think that something of the spirit of that can help us very much, that the idea of being developed as professionals is not necessarily superior to the idea of going off and reading a book that will stretch our thinking and that will make us feel happy about going into the classroom the next day. It would be refreshing to trade in some of the more dreary professional development for intellectual activity. So along these lines, I'll mention several sources of hope. The first is the fairly young tradition of philosophy roundtables at Columbia Secondary School for Math, Science, and Engineering, where I teach. Although I started these roundtables, they've turned into something for which I can take no credit. Began last year when I thought it would be nice to invite parents in to discuss some of the ideas and texts that the students were discussing in class. That way the parents could have a chance to find out what their children were learning. So every 2 months or so, I held a roundtable primarily for parents and staff. The attendance was sparse but enthusiastic, and the 90 minutes for the roundtable flew by as we discussed John Stuart Mill, Martin Buber, and others. Then at the end of the year, at my principal's suggestion, I had a roundtable led by students. 15 students signed up to do this and committed themselves to this. And the roundtable focused on the question, how does one foster and preserve independent thought in a society that often discourages it? Favorite topic. And they pulled together passages from Orwell's 1984, Ionesco's Rhinoceros, Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, E.B. White's essay Freedom, and Erasmus's Praise of Folly, which is actually a favorite among the students. Over 30 parents and guests were in attendance, and the discussion was both structured and spontaneous, very witty at times, and people came out of it exhilarated. One parent commented to me that she wished adults could speak to each other in this manner. And I was delighted to see the roundtable exceeding the original idea. And this year we continue to have roundtables which are now attended by parents, students, guests, and staff. After every roundtable, the participants sense that something special has occurred. Yet this is the simple ritual of gathering together to discuss interesting texts and ideas. Our most recent roundtable, which felt the fastest, was on the subject of time. And we read passages from St. Augustine's Confessions, a different passage, Alan Lightman's Einstein's Dreams, a wonderful collection of stories, and T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, the very beginning. And a chess master joined us and made some interesting comments on chess and time, chess time. Participants ranged in age from 11 to 67, and we touched on physics, metaphysics, poetry, and art, but kept the discussion focused nonetheless. In a similar spirit, I'm encouraged by the work of institutions that devote themselves to intellectual life, such as the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture, with which I now have an association of several years. The Dallas Institute has many classes and events year-round. One of its oldest courses is a Sue Rose Summer Institute for Teachers, which brings teachers together to immerse themselves in literature. In the odd-numbered years, the teachers read tragedy and comedy, and then in the even-numbered years, this coming summer, the Institute focuses on epic. And the purpose is not to teach teachers how to teach literature, but rather to enlarge their understanding. And the effect on teachers is profound and often dramatic. I've seen teachers break down in tears because they saw the gulf between this kind of immersion in something meaningful and what they were told to do in the schools. But they also start to feel hope that through the very attention to literature, they can ground themselves again in what matters. And a third on this, I have to mention the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere. I just had a wonderful couple of days here. And what has really impressed me was the willingness of people from different fields to come together to discuss ideas and the willingness to make time for it. We yesterday had a lovely seminar where people from numerous fields gathered to discuss Martin Buber and Rilke's sonnet. And for 2 hours, in a rush day, everybody's very busy. But that ability to make time is something very important, and I sensed that there was an understanding of this among all the participants, that yes, we are capable of making time. Yes, we are capable of creating the necessary leisure for thought and for independent thought, for careful thought. It does require leisure. We cannot subject ourselves continually to a rush. So I do wish to thank you for these beautiful days. So one answer to the question, what can be done, lies in turning our attention toward things that matter, particularly subject matter. But that is not enough. We must also take the time, as you do, to make our work intelligible to the outside world, to let others know what we do and why. This work of translation takes patience, but is essential to an institution's well-being. It can ease the burden of many accountability demands. If, for instance, a principal knows how to explain to officials that her school is actually going beyond the level of the standardized tests, she may be able to protect its standing. And that's something, in fact, that my principal has been doing actively. If she can explain the content of the curriculum and the practices of the teachers, if she can say, this is what we do and why, she will convey what a good evaluator would want to hear, that the school is dedicated to educating its students and knows how to do so. This translation work is an act of goodwill. It conveys trust that despite the severe ideological rifts in education, we still have a common purpose, to bring young people to a point where they can find their way into and through the world. And recognizing the common purpose can help us avoid destructive conflicts and thrive on conflicts that stimulate thought. This does not mean, though, that educators should tolerate nonsense. When asked to do something that will damage our endeavor, we can firmly say no. For example, many college departments are under pressure to abandon lectures across the board and to adopt something called the flipped classroom and other supposedly newer pedagogies. Well, while this may be appropriate and helpful for certain courses, it would ruin others. It is good to have a variety of course structures, lectures, workshops, seminars, labs, to support different subjects and different angles on the subjects. Eliminating lectures altogether, turning classes into an ongoing workshop, would eliminate a great part of college education, the opportunity to listen to an extended presentation by someone with deep knowledge of the field. And I'm appalled by the perception that listening to a lecture is necessarily passive learning. That's some of the lectures that I've listened to have had the much greater influence on my education when I look back than some of the more rapid conversations that I have had. But both of these have a place. That's the thing that's important. In addition, we should be wary of jargon that takes over and distorts our work. And I mentioned this earlier, but one overused work that doesn't get questioned enough is team. Recently, it seems that everyone has become part of a team or multiple teams, whereas in the past they used to be faculty members, members of associations, and even individuals. Horrifying. Why quibble over words? The words matter. That's the point. The word team carries the connotation of unity and tightly coordinated action. This is not appropriate for all associations at all times. For instance, college faculty work together but also do a great deal of work alone, and that work alone should be honored, not stigmatized. A team is practical. It gets the ball to the other end of the field. An association of individuals may have a little more room for contemplation and solitude. Teams do have an important place in our lives, but not everything is a team, nor should it be. So why is the concept of solitude so important to education? In our crowded facilities and schedules, solitude, even in the presence of others, and I'll show the last picture here. This is my students' roundtable. You feel a certain solitude in it. They're thinking. They're busy thinking. We see just the backs of their heads, but that's for confidentiality reasons. But that was the roundtable we had last June. In solitude, one can tinker with ideas that do not have immediate use and that others might not accept. As I mentioned at the beginning, solitude allows for true dialogue, since the two participants come together with fullness of mind. Returning to Wordsworth's poem, one can hear dialogue in it between the outward and the inward I, the loneliness and the company, the I am and the dactyl, and other rhythms that crop up in there, the speaker and the daffodils. If one breezes over it, if one hears only a sweet poem about daffodils, and that's how it's often taken, as a sweet poem, and one must be alone with it in order to hear the conversations in it. At our most recent philosophy roundtable, we were at one point discussing the distinction Alan Lightman makes in Einstein's dreams between body time and mechanical time. Our 11-year-old participant objected that there was no such distinction, since we perceive so-called mechanical time, the time of clocks, of which I'm well aware, right, through our subjective body time. So we are subjective even in our perception of the time on a clock, on a watch. This set off an interesting discussion of the purpose of watches and clocks. Another participant, who was an engineer and mathematician, suggested that mechanical time served primarily to bring people together into the same room at the same time to do something together, that if we did not have a common measure of time, we would have no way to assemble. Like a clock, but in a different manner, education makes it possible for us to assemble. Such assembly is built on the encounter with ideas, which in turn requires solitude. The liveliest discussion, like St. Augustine's conversation with the stars, sun, moon, seas, and creatures, contains an element of aloneness. Nothing could be more elusive than the principle of honoring solitude. Solitude is everywhere and nowhere. It defies any efforts to pin it down. Nor is solitude the ultimate good. It only allows us to pursue the good. It does not take the same form for any two people, thus it cannot be turned into policy. I shudder at the thought of requiring a solitude activity in the classrooms. Nonetheless, one can tell when it is honored and when it is not. When it is pushed aside, things get noisy, voices collide, and coherent thought falls away. When it is present, it makes way for meaning. Every object in the room receives and offers thought. A book contains not only takeaways, but a call to return to its words and to think about them some more. In a culture that asks us to join the group, come up with snappy answers, and meet numerous outside demands, there is both rebellion and restoration in independent thought. No matter what the pressures, we can walk off alone, take time with interesting things, and wend our way past faulty understandings. Thank you.
Dr. Senechal has agreed to field some questions from the audience, so I will let her. Question?
Yes, please.
That was a beautiful and inspirational talk.
Thank you.
So, as a scientist and working in one of those diverse fields that you aren't finding normal in humanities, I teach a rather dry topic, which is filled with facts and memorization. I sit for 120 students. How am I to inspire these students? How am I to get them to see the solitude and the beauty of what is going on the screen? How am I not just teaching them facts and lists? What advice do you have for a teacher or somebody who doesn't study literature, doesn't teach music?
Well, I'll give an example from a few years ago while I was working my book. What subject do you teach?
I teach them to look through a microscope and identify tissues. I see the beauty of it. I look through a microscope and it's an amazing world. But the students look through it and all they can do is learn to name the cells.
So, a few years ago, I audited a physics class while I was working on my book. So I wanted to answer some questions for myself while I was doing this. And I remember one lesson where the professor, who's a renowned astrophysicist, he was showing us Keplers Second Law. And first he proved it using Newton's method. And then he proved it using trigonometry, and then he had a third method of proving it. And as I was watching, I didn't understand quite yet what was going on, but I saw that the proofs could somehow be translated one into the next. And I remember walking out of that lecture hall with a sense, even though I hadn't put it all together in my mind yet, with a sense of exhilaration, that I was on the verge of something, that if I just sat down and worked on it some more, I would figure it out. And perhaps that's, I don't know whether that answers your question, but I think that students can begin to see the beauty of it when they start to notice the patterns, when they start to notice associations between things that they're observing. Does that work for you?
I
And that's a similar problem that English teachers face. So it sounds to me as though what you're talking about the pressure that you face as a result of the accreditation, demands of accreditation, that you could teach in a different manner that would inspire the students. So the question is not how will I interest the students, you already know how to do that. But the question is how do I contend with these pressures? And my only answer to that is just do so. Teach somewhat rebelliously, make some room for the interesting part. And I know that's no answer to your practical question. But thank you. Yes.
So also, thank you for your talk. I think one thing that your talk did for me was really flesh out what it is that's intrinsically valuable about educational experience and how we want to make sure, I think, that students from lots of different backgrounds have access to that kind of experience. That would be a really good thing. But education also it's also instrumentally valuable. And some students, and you acknowledge this in your talk, are going to, for reasons that have nothing to do with school, have a lot of difficulty getting into the right space to access that kind of educational experience. You said, look, yes, standards might be important, or we want to worry about really disadvantaged kids and getting the right kind of skills, right? So I didn't quite catch your reply to the worry that when it comes to really disadvantaged kids, this might be a little too nuanced, a little too idealistic, right? We need to first be sure we get them the real world skills they need so that they can survive in the world they're likely to inhabit.
So there are two answers that I would give. First of all, it's a difficult question, and I don't have a complete answer to it. But first of all, that results often take place over a long term. So where we might not see an immediate result, we might see something later on. And policymakers often don't take that into account enough. So students may not show evidence of learning, of mastering the concept that day in the classroom, but months later, they may get it. And I've seen this happen in many cases. As for the question of whether some of the students who are severely behind should be given the more basic skills first, I do not see a discrepancy between doing that and exposing them to the interesting ideas. I taught English language learners in my first few years of teaching, and I found that they were especially excited when they got to read interesting literature. And Shakespeare was a favorite. And I remember the student who started reading Romeo and Juliet while he was walking home from school with the book open. And his friends made fun of him, but they understood too because they were excited about it. And students who would stop me in the hallway so they could recite a sonnet once more. They were so proud of having memorized that and having come to understand that. So that I think that those challenges of that kind can help students so much with the basics that can be combined in an interesting way with some of the more basic instruction. So, but it takes a very even that sounds a bit idealistic, and it takes certain conditions in the school that are not always there. It takes the possibility of working with the students over the longer term. It takes a little bit more time within the lesson than is often there, and other factors can help as well. But I still believe that it is possible. I've seen students make enormous strides starting from a place where their skills and knowledge were quite basic. Yes.
So I'm a foreigner, and and I recently started to live in America. So a lot of what I hear in terms of the education system petrifies me. And I remember once as a student, a graduate student, we took a class which involved reading this paper entitled "Who is a Professional?" And apparently, a professional class, when you enter that class, because there's a notion that if you do teach in a standardized way, you're perhaps teaching to the masses. There is an elite that is professional,
Yeah.
they are required to have judgment and discernment. And I mean, in my own way, and I guess in my own country, I would be regarded as an elite. And I had to look that word up because they said in society you need the elite and you need the masses. So now that I live here and I have a daughter, I'm wondering what system is she entering? Do you understand? Because
Yes.
where I'm from, I would be in the elite. So how would you enter?
Yes, and that's a very important question, and I have a similar concern that there's a patronizing aspect to the emphasis on teaching skills to the students at the lowest level, and it's sometimes unintended. But the assumption that that's all they can really do right now, or that we have to focus on the skills primarily because if we don't, then their lives will fall apart and so forth. And the idea that, and then in the meantime, other students are grappling with interesting ideas. And the students who are focusing on the skills have no knowledge of this other world. And this plays out in yet another manner as well. I'm skeptical of some of the behavior codes that exist, highly regimented behavior codes that exist in some schools where students are taught exactly how any divergence from the expected behavior results in a penalty. So students are taught to sit up, to look directly at the speaker, eyes on speaker, to speak in a particular way, begin with certain phrases, to walk in perfect line down the corridor, and so on. And what's interesting about that is that they are actually, by learning these particular codes, these are not codes of the elite, they are marking themselves out as members of a subordinate class. So if they go to college, they will see their middle class classmates acting in a much more relaxed manner, not beginning their comments with these predetermined phrases, but speaking a little bit more spontaneously and informally, walking more informally, conducting themselves slightly more informally, but still with focus, and they will, it'd be a strange divide between those two. And I think of the movie Office Space, which some of you may have seen, where the guy rises to the top by acting very relaxed and basically acting as though he doesn't have a care in the world, and that conveys a certain kind of elitism. But I believe there's a profound meaning to that as well, which is that education does require leisure. We do need a certain amount of rest in order to wrestle with ideas. And many of these children are not given that. And so, this just opens up the need for children across the board to have an opportunity to encounter ideas, to have interesting discussions, to learn how to make fine judgments. So it cannot focus just on skills, because the skills will not get there. The skills reach a certain point and then they cut off. You cannot advance beyond that with that kind of instruction. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes.
I have enjoyed you being here because, quite honestly, I teach at middle school and you're inspirational. So thank you for coming in. I'm from science background also. I'm a scientist turned science teacher. And I find beauty in science. And that's what I want to impart, that enthusiasm for the beauty in my field. I know there's a rigor in science, but there's also an imagination and a beauty in trying to understand the world around us. And just as some find beauty in poetry, and I enjoy the humanities, but I'm especially in tune to the sciences because I find the natural world to be an amazing place. And I think I got that from my early childhood teachers who would allow us to run outside and grasp the snowflakes and come into the microscope and look at them really quickly. And it obviously couldn't have been a planned activity because who knew when it was going to snow? You know, and to open up a fish, to dissect it, and to look at the beauty of the scales and the bones inside it, and to see nature as an extension of yourself and to be so beautiful, and really it opened science up for me. And
Yes, and unfortunately, I see the more and more disparagement of the act of teaching. The teachers are supposed to get out of the way, let the students do the work, and again, it's a false dichotomy. That students are often doing an awful lot of work in their mind when they're paying attention to a teacher's presentation, and that can lead to very interesting discussions among the students. So teachers, I agree with you fully. Teachers should not hesitate to convey what they love about the subject. Yes, please.
I'm curious about the practical problem of justifying the mystery that you talked about of education. I think the hardest thing to do to explain the liberal arts and sciences is to explain them to people who have not experienced them. And in our state, we've got a governor and state legislatures and the board of governors. Surprisingly, the board of governors in the university almost entirely are without a liberal arts education. So how do we find the words to explain that mystery to them? I've just come from 5 weeks of teaching Emerson and Thoreau, who seem right on this.
Yes.
And what Thoreau says, of course, those first 2 chapters of Walden were addressed to his townspeople.
Yeah.
And they were used to going to church and being told they were immoral, but they weren't used to going to church, going to a lecture and being told they were impractical. That's what Thoreau tells us. You're impractical not to think about these things. And I'm not sure how we find the way of saying that. Thoreau is going to be controversial and a scold, but somehow we have to find those words that explain what we do to people who have never experienced what we do and are deeply distrustful of words like mystery.
Yes, yes. And another important difference is that we don't have that many places of assembly to talk about these things. That many occasions. Thoreau was able to address the townspeople. And that is something that would make a difference, having more ways of bringing people together. Because even the distrustful can take interest when they have room to do so. And I believe that part of the problem is that people feel so harried. They worry. Their distrust often comes from worry about what others will say if they don't meet the expectations that are foisted on them. They're supposed to show that they've made the others accountable. And if they're not doing that, well, then they'll get in trouble as well. So people's continual fear of getting in trouble and of not getting things done on time is distorting the conversation. And it's a bigger problem than that, though. But the distrust of mystery is also, as you say, it has to do with not knowing what a liberal education is. So part of the response to that, which is slow, of course, is to begin offering a liberal education and hope that the next generation, or over time, the value will be understood better by more of the people who make policy decisions.
But would you agree that education, as you and I would define it, is being replaced by training?
Yes, yes,
That's what schools and colleges
Yes.
do now.
yes,
It's training.
yes. And many policymakers are unapologetic about this. They see this as the way to go.
Right.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, so how about the introvert and the extrovert? And we might think the introvert is more introvert to be in solitude as opposed to not. Do you address that?
Yes and no. I believe that most of us are combinations, and I don't see a big polarization between introvert and extrovert. For instance, in the classroom, a student who is very interested in subject may be introverted in one sense, in the sense of going off and reading a lot alone, but extroverted in the sense of being involved in class discussion. So the ones who are involved in class discussion are not necessarily extroverts in all senses of the word. We have our places of liveliness, and there we may seem very extroverted in our places of liveliness, but that also requires some time alone. So first of all, I question the divisions, but if we go with the idea that most of us have a combination of introversion and extroversion, I would agree with people like Susan Cain that the introverted part is being pushed aside. It isn't given enough honor in the classrooms. That students are expected to say a lot, to say it quickly, come to quick conclusions, to work in groups and so on, and that's only one side of what matters in education. That we need to honor the other part or other parts. It doesn't just consist of two. So I'm not sure whether that answers your question.
I'm just going to add follow-up, just maybe a piece on solitude, because something just occurred to me, and we'll talk more later, but what about the teacher remaining silent? Could you talk a little bit about the importance of having the teacher stay silent rather than always having not just the students to have time to be silent, but the teacher in the context of the classroom remaining silent?
Well, and there are different kinds of silence. For instance, in a discussion, it's very important for a teacher to allow for considerable silences between comments, between a question and a response. But the students have to get used to that too. If they're not used to that, they may wonder what's going wrong, why the teacher isn't stepping in and doing something. And my students are quite used to the long silences, and they like it. And I've seen interesting things happen, and I tried to wait even longer than I'm used to doing, and I wait quite a bit. And we were having a discussion on John Locke earlier in the fall, and I posed a problem, making sense of a passage, and students were not responding. I said, well, I'll wait, you can figure it out. And there was no response, and waited longer, and then a few students offered a few responses that weren't quite there. And I said, I'll wait longer. And then a student who really had not spoken much all semester raised his hand and absolutely nailed it. He had a way of putting together that passage that was coherent and sharp and right on target. And he was so proud of that moment that he began participating a lot more actively in class. And so what that told me was that there are students who really benefit from a chance to think things through, benefit from being given time to think about things. And so that's one way. A teacher can wait longer than he or she is used to doing, but there are different kinds of silence in the classroom as well. Giving students a chance to read something quietly or to write something quietly, and all of that depends on the structure of the course and the lesson and so forth, but there are many opportunities for it. Another thing that I found helpful for my students was to give them a chance to listen to things. I realized they didn't have much practice just listening to something. So last year, once a week, I brought in a piece of music, and they would listen to it, and that was all they were expected to do. No outcomes, no products, just listen to this piece of music. And at first they were nervous, they were a little bit fidgety, but then a calm would take over the room, and it became one of their favorite activities. They would look forward to it every week. What are we going to listen to this time? And